It is now Thursday evening for the Parsha of Vayera, the fourth Parsha in Bereshit, the first book of the 5 books of Moses. A remarkable Parsha, one which actually has been covered in the class that I recorded previously, because the profiles of the figures exemplifying the various levels of love, Hanoch, Noach, Abraham, and Moshe, are also based on the Parsha of Vayera, as I mentioned that. But nonetheless, there's so many rich ideas, and there's a beautiful and profound teaching, a esoteric one, which is also very relevant for our lives, that I wanted to do that as well. As you may have seen in the WhatsApp communication, in addition to reading from the 5 books of Moses each Shabbat, we conclude by reading a portion, a selection from the prophetic writings. And this harkens back to a period where at one time, a very long time ago, it was prohibited for the Jews to have the public Torah readings from the 5 books of Moses, from the Torah scroll. And so they tried to circumvent this, or to some way approximate the Torah reading in a way that would not contradict the law, by instead reading from the prophetic writings, finding for each portion a section from the prophets that in some ways paralleled that portion. Later on, when this decree was canceled, it was thought appropriate not to remove this wonderful custom, and so now we have the current practice of reading from the 5 books of Moses and from the prophetic writings. And there's always a challenge, and from both the scriptural point of view and symbolic point of view, to try to understand what the connection is. This week's Haftara is really powerful. Those of you on the group have already seen the link, and I do urge you to read it. I'll try to give a quick summary. It begins with a poor woman who is described as being from the wives of the sons of the prophets. And indeed, she is a widow, and according to tradition, her deceased husband was none other than the prophet Obadiah. And she comes to Elisha, the great prophet, the disciple of Eliyahu, of Elijah, and she says that her husband has died, and she is penniless, and indeed the creditors have come to take her 2 sons as slaves. And to this Elisha replies, "What have you got in the house?" And she says, "Your maidservant has nothing more than a small vessel of oil." And to this Elisha replies, "Go and take from the outside, take from your neighbors, vessels, containers, as many as possible." In Hebrew, he says, "Lo tamitu." It shouldn't be a small amount. Don't, as much as possible. Empty vessels. Kelim rekim al tamitu. Do not minimize in any way the possibility. As many empty vessels as possible. And from this little cruse of oil, from this little container of oil, start pouring into them. And as long as there are empty vessels, the oil will continue to pour. And indeed she did this, and when the last vessel was filled, the oil stopped. The oil only poured as long as there were empty vessels to pour the oil into. And that is the first story of the Haftarah. It is followed by a second story, also about a woman. This woman is not poor. She's the Shunammite woman. And she had the custom of giving accommodations to Elisha when he would pass through her region. At one point he wanted to reward her for this, and he asked, "What is it that you need?" And she said, "We have no son." And in the verse which parallels the Parsha, he says that in a year at this time, you will embrace a son. This is the key verse in a sense, because the Parsha of Vayera begins with the three angels visiting Abraham, and one of them telling him the good news that Sarah, hitherto barren, not to mention after menopause, they're both old, will miraculously have a son. Sarah is incredulous, she doesn't believe it, but the message concludes, is anything beyond Hashem? At the appointed time, I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. It's the same form. At another time, a year from now, you will have a son. So clearly, we don't have to look too far for the parallel of this story. The question will remain, we'll come back to it, why the first story about the poor widow, the wife, the widow of Ovadia, the prophet, and her poverty, and the two sons? What is the connection there? After the story of how the Shunammite woman is blessed with a son, according to the Sephardic tradition, that is where the Haftarah reading ends, but in the Ashkenazic tradition, it continues with a continuation of the story, remarkable continuation, reflecting Elisha's spiritual greatness. The boy is born, and he grows to an extent, and at one point becomes extremely ill, and he dies. The Shunammite woman takes him, brings him back to Elisha, and I didn't mention it. When he first gives her this blessing, she says to him, "Do not lie to your servant." Now the one takes that superficially, "Oh, come on, I can't have children, I'm too old, I've been barren my whole life. Don't get my hopes up." But now we see in retrospect, apparently she also had some kind of prophetic talents, or some kind of feeling that this would happen. And she goes back, and she says to Elisha, "Did I not tell you not to deceive me?" And the story ends with Elisha bringing the boy back to life. He places his mouth on his mouth. It looks something like mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in its form, but indeed the story is about how he was brought back after having already died. And with that, the story concludes. She bows in gratitude, takes the son, and goes back home. So those are three stories from the Haftarah. The poor widow of Ovadia the prophet, who was then able to pay her creditors by selling the miraculous oil that came about when she got lots of empty vessels. The Shunammite woman, who was not poor, but was childless, who was blessed with a child. And finally, the miraculous episode of how, when the son of the Shunammite woman died, he was brought back to life by Elisha the prophet. We will discuss the connection and the lesson from these three stories in the next